The Committee Against Torture was created by the Convention Against Torture, where state members report to the committee on the steps they have taken to implement the convention. It is a treaty body created to monitor and encourage states to uphold and implement the international obligations under the convention, and mandated to carry out several activities to monitor the implementation of states parties' obligations under the convention, including overseeing the reporting cycle for each state party and issuing general comments to interpret and develop provisions of the convention. So what is this convention all about? The Torture Convention was the result of many years' work initiated soon after the adoption of the Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from being subjected to torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment by the General Assembly on December 9, 1975. And following the 1975 Convention Against Torture, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on December 10, 1984. The convention entered into force on June 26, 1987, after it had been ratified by 20 states. The prohibition of torture and other forms of ill treatment. The prohibition against torture and other forms of ill treatment is well established as one of the few absolute human rights which must be respected without any restriction or derogation. Under international law, this is known as a jus cogens norm. This applies even in times of war or threat of war, internal political instability or public emergency, and there are no exceptional circumstances whatsoever under which torture can be justified, including any threat of terrorist acts or violent crime, or religious or traditional justification. The prohibition against torture and other forms of ill treatment is embodied in several international human rights treaties and declarations, which includes the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. The Convention Against Torture. The purpose of the convention is to prevent and eradicate the use of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, and to ensure accountability for acts of torture. There are currently 170 states parties to the convention. The convention represents the most detailed international codification of standards and practices regarding the prohibition against torture. It sets out the most widely accepted definition of torture at the international level, obliges the states to take all necessary legislative, administrative, judicial, and other appropriate measures to prevent acts of torture, and specifies a range of additional steps that states must take to adequately prevent, prohibit, and redress torture and guarantee non-recurrence. This includes an obligation not to extradite, deport, expel, or otherwise transfer a person to a state where there would be at risk of torture or ill treatment. The criminalization of torture under domestic law, establishing universal jurisdiction over torture, training officials in reviewing detention procedures, ensuring remedies for victims of torture, including the right to complain and the right to redress, and ensuring that torture evidence is not used in any proceedings. The scope of the convention. Although Article 1 of the convention is generally considered to be the internationally agreed definition of torture, it contains a fairly narrow interpretation of torture. Other regional treaties have broader definitions and interpretations of what treatment amounts to torture. Further definitions of torture have developed through the jurisprudence of regional courts. In addition, the definition of torture under the convention today should be read alongside the interpretations contained within the general comments of the Committee Against Torture. The definition of torture under the Convention contains four main elements: the infliction of severe pain or suffering, the requirement of intent, the requirement of a specific purpose, and the involvement of a public official.